following podcast is taken from a webinar presented by Dr. Jesse Goff from Iowa State University, titled Why Cows Become Hypocalcemic and the Steps to Reduce the Impact. This webinar was presented back in August of 2020, but offers great insight into the topic. To view the full webinar and access the slides presented, visit balchem.com/realscience. Scroll down to past webinars and enter Goff, G-O-F-F, in the search bar.
The economics of feeding Reassure precision-release choline. Reassure is fed during the transition period, and because it's fed for such a short period of time, it costs just $15 per cow, and yet the benefits will continue to generate income throughout the year. Cows fed Reassure produce 5 pounds more colostrum, which pays for your Reassure investment on the very first day of lactation. Cows fed Reassure also produce 5 pounds more milk per day, every day. That means after the first day, every day is payday. Invest in Reassure during the transition period and recoup your investment on the very first day of lactation. After that, you got it. Payday.
Well, when I look at this transition cow, I think she's got 3 major problems. She's got to face negative energy and protein balance. She's immune suppressed, and very often cows are hypocalcemic. Surveys, including one that we did some years ago, suggest about half of the older cows are hypocalcemic. How you define that, we'll talk about in some detail later. But even heifers, some of them will be hypocalcemic, subclinical. About 3% of dairy cows will have such a severe hypocalcemia that they develop this disease called milk fever. Irregardless, hypocalcemia is one of the major players in immune suppression and other problems of the transition cow. Why do cows get hypocalcemic? It's pretty simple. The calcium content of their blood is only 3 to 4 grams, and they're making milk that puts out a lot more calcium than 3 to 4 grams per day. And they'll develop hypocalcemia if they don't replace that calcium from either their bone or from the dietary calcium that they're trying to absorb. Now let's look at calcium dynamics just at around the time of calving. A day before calving, this cow needs about 18 grams of calcium absorbed from her diet each day for maintenance and fetal skeletal development. The day of calving, she starts making colostrum. And then you look at that second milk as well. She still has a maintenance requirement. It's somewhere between 50 and 55 grams of calcium that have to be absorbed that first day of lactation. That's about 32 grams of extra calcium that has to be brought in. Those of you who really want to read a great paper, Charlie Ramberg did all this stuff with radioisotope, radioactive calcium back in the late 70s and early 80s that really shows the dynamics of this movement of calcium from the blood into the mammary gland. Well, there is a calcium homeostasis mechanism, and it revolves around the parathyroid glands and parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid glands are located in the region of the neck, just outside the thyroid gland, and it monitors any kind of change in blood calcium concentration. Even a small drop in blood calcium concentration signals a large release of parathyroid hormone from these glands. Now, let's take a look at this cow. It's just calved. She's making a lot of milk. Calcium's leaving the mammary gland, and that will cause a small drop in serum calcium concentration. This is picked up by the parathyroid glands, which then secrete parathyroid hormone. Now that parathyroid hormone circulates, travels to the kidney, and it travels to the bone. Those are the 2 major targets. In the kidney, parathyroid hormone drops the amount of calcium excreted out in the urine. Unfortunately, in a cow, this is not very much calcium each day. The other main action of parathyroid hormone on the kidney is to allow conversion of this vitamin D compound that we feed cows, takes one of those metabolites and converts it to 125 dihydroxy vitamin D. This is the active hormone. This is the hormonal form of vitamin D that's going to act on the intestine and hopefully cause intestinal calcium absorption. What that does is the 125 vitamin D interacts with the receptor in the intestinal epithelial cells, causes production of a few proteins that are involved in calcium absorption, and they will carry calcium across that cell and pump it into the bloodstream. And when that's working well, we get a nice response. Calcium that's in our diet is absorbed nicely, and we get calcium released from the bone in response to parathyroid hormone. And those bone cells activate bone calcium resorption mechanisms, and we'll see a nice rise in serum calcium concentration. This is calcium homeostasis. Unfortunately, calcium homeostasis doesn't work as well as we'd like it to in all cows, particularly older cows. And one of the reasons older cows have more problems with calcium homeostasis is that as they get older, they lose the number of vitamin D receptors in those intestinal epithelial cells. This is true in cows, it's true in humans, most every other species that's been looked at. Older cows are no longer growing. You look at a heifer, she's still growing her bones. She's still gaining height. That means the heifer has plenty of osteoclasts, this bone resorbing cell in her bones. And those cells are already present and capable of responding to PTH very rapidly. As a cow gets older, osteoclast numbers drop. She has to recruit new osteoclasts and then activate them. And that's what takes so much time for her and allows her blood calcium to fall too low. Well, the final actor in this is pH of the blood. And it turns out that as animals become alkaline, they become less responsive to parathyroid hormone. It turns out it's the high DCAD diets that cause this metabolic alkalosis, which can lead to milk fever and certainly hypocalcemia. Some of this is probably old hat for everybody, but I'm going to go through it rather quickly. The DCAD, the current equation that's most popular for describing the dietary cation-anion difference, or DCAD, is the number of milliequivalents of sodium in the diet plus the milliequivalents of potassium in the diet. Subtract out the milliequivalents of chloride and sulfate. Cations versus anions. Unfortunately, the potassium that's in forages fed to cows is very readily available, and it causes the blood and urine of the cow to become alkaline. And these high blood pH levels seem to inhibit parathyroid hormone from binding to its receptor. In this little cartoon, we've got a system here where we've got a blood pH of about 7.35, which would be considered slightly acidic for a cow, probably typical of a human. Here we've got parathyroid hormone being released in response to hypocalcemia. It binds to its receptor in a nice lock and key fit. That stimulates adenyl cyclase, an enzyme in the cell membrane, and that stimulates cyclic AMP production, and that signals the bone cell or the kidney cell to become active. Unfortunately, in the middle panel, in the middle panel here, we've got a blood pH that's a little bit higher, indicative of a cow on a high potassium diet. Now the receptor takes on a strange shape. It no longer recognizes parathyroid hormone very well. We don't activate this adenyl cyclase enzyme. The cyclic AMP is not made. The bone and the kidney cells are incapable of responding to that parathyroid hormone. Later in the presentation, we'll talk about this third situation where you can have an animal that's acidotic, or at least not severely alkalotic. But if there's no magnesium atoms sitting at this site, again, the animal fails to produce cyclic AMP. So hypomagnesemia is something we'll talk about as a cause of hypocalcemia a little later in the talk. So Alkalosis, we're not going to get activation of those systems. Oh boy. We're not going to get activation of these systems to bring calcium back into the bloodstream. The animal becomes more and more hypocalcemic. A little bit about timing of these things and how long it takes to turn on the different systems. If you look at the kidney, parathyroid hormone can reduce urinary calcium loss to just about zero within a few minutes. In a normal cow, this will only bring about 1 gram of calcium into the blood. It's better than nothing, but it's not very much calcium. If you look at synthesis of 125 dihydroxyvitamin D by the kidney, if the animal's in an acidic condition, has been fed an anionic diet, that will occur within about 10 hours. If they've been fed an alkaline diet, a high potassium diet, it may take as long as 20 hours for them to begin to make a significant amount of 125 dihydroxyvitamin D. Now we look at the intestine. It takes anywhere from 12 to 24 hours for the intestinal epithelial cells to begin to make those proteins that are crucial to calcium absorption. How much calcium can this bring into the blood? In some degree, it depends on the dietary calcium. Particularly in early lactation diets, we probably should be bumping the dietary calcium up a little bit higher. If we look at the bone, osteocytes are able to resorb calcium from the bone fluids, and that occurs within 6 to 12 hours. If the animal's been on an alkaline diet, only about 9 grams of calcium are available to be absorbed by this process. If she's been fed an anion diet, a low DCAD diet, upwards of 15 grams of calcium may be absorbed rapidly by the osteocytes. Next come the osteoclasts. These cells take anywhere from 16 to 96 hours to become active. And that depends partly on the age of the cow and again on her diet. If she's on an anion diet, this appears to be happening faster than if she's on an alkaline diet. This brings in huge amounts of calcium into the blood. Over the course of the first 4 to 5 weeks of lactation, upwards of 1.2 kilograms of calcium can be resorbed from the bones of the cow. So let's go over something called the DCAD strategy. First step in this is to reduce dietary potassium because you want to reduce the alkalosis that the cow is experiencing. To do this, you've got to use forages from fields that have not had any manure applied to them. This means setting aside some fields that are just for use of growing dry cow forages. Another strategy, oh boy, another strategy is to use warm season grasses versus cool season grasses. Warm season grasses don't accumulate potassium out of the soil the way the cool season grasses do. And of course, corn or maize is a great warm season grass to use in transition cow diets, close-up cow diets. As plants mature, whether they're cool season or warm season, the amount of potassium they contain decreases. And so these diets that are using a lot of wheat straw in them tend to be lower potassium diets because that old straw is low in potassium. Just as an aside, corn stover, you would think corn stover would be great. It's going to be very low potassium. It has a couple problems. Number one, it has to be chopped very fine to get cows to eat it. And even if you do that, you're going to find that cows will manage to sort and they don't like corn stover very much. So despite the fact it sounds great, we haven't had much luck using corn stover. Okay, you've tried to reduce potassium in the diet as much as you can. Now you're going to come back in and add anions, these acidifying anions to the diet to try to improve parathyroid hormone responsiveness of the tissue. And those anions are primarily chloride and sulfate. So how do we choose the right anion sources? Well, this is a study we did many years ago now, and the gist of it is that the sulfate sources do not acidify as well as the chloride sources. really surprised us at the time we did this, because mag sulfate had been the backbone of almost all DCAD programs at the time, yet mag sulfate wasn't very acidifying. It was, however, a very good and available source of magnesium, which is why it probably was so successful in the early days. Another thing that came as a surprise was sulfuric acid. Such a strong acid, when fed to the cow, didn't acidify them as well as, say, calcium chloride or ammonium chloride or even hydrochloric acid. And it's because we now know the sulfate moiety isn't absorbed as well as the chloride moiety from the intestinal tract. So, after looking at this kind of data, the sulfate salts acidify about 60% as well as the chloride salts. Maybe a better DCAD equation would be to take the milliequivalent sodium, milliequivalent potassium, milliequivalent chloride, and discount sulfate a little bit. Next story, palatability of anions. Anionic diets, when they first came out, had all kinds of issues. The traditional salts, ammonium chloride, ammonium sulfate, mag sulfate that were used in those early diets, cows had trouble eating them. When you could get a cow to eat them, they worked great. But there were so many farms where we had so much trouble getting animals to eat those diets in enough amount, enough quantity to acidify the cow. So now my little commercial here, I guess. Soychlor was invented for that reason. If I could have cured all the cows of milk fever using traditional anionic salts, there's no way I would have spent the time and effort to invent Soychlor. One of the reasons Soychlor and some of the other commercial products have become so popular is because they are consumed by the cow. And if you look, this is a study done, presented at the ADSA meeting in 2016. Here we have cows that were fed traditional anionic salts versus cows that were fed Soychlor. Both cows at exactly the same urine pH levels, and by about 25 days before calving, all the cows were on their diets for at least a week. And so now you can see that the cows fed the traditional anionic salts have a much greater decrease in dry matter intake as calving approaches than the cows fed the Soychlor diet. And it amounts to 1.5 kilos or so per day of intake. And that is probably why not just Soychlor, but many of the other anion products that are on the market have taken hold over the traditional anionic salts. You can get cows to eat them. Now we're going to come to the idea of under-acidification and over-acidification of cows being fed anion products. This is a bunch of urine pHs that I'm stealing from Peter Constable's paper. And then we applied some DCAD numbers here from the Spanghero and Charbonneau work, and then some of my own little twist in here as well. Let's start over here on the far upper right. Let's say you've got a diet where it's about a DCAD of about plus 400. You'll find that the urine pH is going to be somewhere around 8.5. It doesn't get much higher than 8.5, even if you continue to raise the DCAD. This is the limit to what the kidney can make in terms of an alkaline urine. It just cannot go much higher than 8.5. As we reduce the DCAD, we get a little frustrated here, maybe because we're not seeing much of a change in urine pH. There's a lot of buffering built into the system. Finally, as we approach about plus 50 milliequivalents per kilogram, the pH starts to drop. And you can see that I'm sorry, I keep hitting this button. And you can see that as the pH drops, as DCAD drops, the pH starts dropping until you hit about 0 milliequivalents per kilogram, when it starts to change very, very rapidly. And then it starts leveling off again here about minus 100 and beyond. This is a typical acid-base titration curve, just like you did in chemistry class. As you approach the point where the pH changes rather rapidly, where you've burned up all the buffer, that pH drops very quickly between, say, 0 and minus 50 milliequivalents per kilogram of diet. Now, one of the things that you'll note is that pH of urine rarely drops below around 5.4. That appears to be about the limit for how much acid can be excreted in the urine. In fact, in the Peter Constable study, what you see is that as animals are fed an even lower DCAD diet, their urine pH starts rising. They explained that by showing that these animals actually decrease their dry matter intake. They're trying to save themselves from an uncompensated metabolic acidosis. And the only way they can do it is to decrease dry matter intake. Well, now you're going to get into my opinion here. This is what I think is a proper approach to DCAD management. I know not everybody agrees with me, but we can argue that out later. Let's say you start out here at the top and you've dropped the DCAD and your urine pH remains above about 7.6. I'm going to tell you, you've got insufficient acidification. You're not going to see any real benefit to blood calcium concentration. If you can get them between 7.6 and about 6.8, you'll see some benefit. We can measure it. It's not as good as we would hope, but you will see some benefit to the acidification and lowering of the DCAD diet. Some people might have referred to this as the partial DCAD diet, where you're somewhere around 0 milliequivalents per kilogram. I think much better place to be is somewhere between about 5.9 and about 6.8, with an average pH of about 6.3 being optimal. Now, what you can see at this point is that a small difference in dry matter intake can have a big difference in the urine pH. We'll come back to that idea in a second. Some nutritionists would like to see urine pH kept somewhere in this area of around 5.5 to say 6.1. To me, this is very close to the point of being overly acidified. I also would challenge you to think about whether or not there is data that shows that this cow is better off than this cow in terms of blood calcium concentration at calving. Now, we can further acidify this cow and put her on a minus 200 or so DCAD diet and realize that that's probably going to impinge on her dry matter intake, because she would be overly acidified in uncompensated metabolic acidosis if she were to eat at the same rate that she might eat that diet when she's up here. So realize that you're seeing this rebound of urine pH coming up here because the cow has compensated for the very negative DCAD diet by decreasing her dry matter intake, reducing the amount of anion load her body is seeing. So run through some scenarios here. Let's say you're feeding nothing but chloride as your anion. And let's say you're feeding Soychlor, my favorite, and you're feeding a diet that's maybe about 0.6% calcium. To hit my sweet spot here of a urine pH of about 6.3, you're going to be feeding a diet with a DCAD of about minus 75 milliequivalents per kilogram. If you choose to feed more traditional anionic salts where chloride and sulfate are used to acidify the animal, to hit my sweet spot here of about 6.3 for a urine pH, you're going to be feeding a diet with a DCAD of about minus 125, because you're relying somewhat on sulfate as an acidifying agent. Now, again, we'll go through those DCAD equations. The traditional equation doesn't take into account the fact that sulfate is not as acidifying as chloride. You can use a better equation where the sulfate is discounted, about 60% as active as chloride. But again, these equations leave out the fact that calcium carbonate might be in a diet or magnesium oxide might be in a diet, and these can be alkalizing. there's an effect of phosphate that's acidifying, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. I would suggest, I propose this, I'm not saying you have to live by it, but there are some pretty good reasons to make a long equation where you give full credit to sodium and potassium. Calcium, maybe a quarter of the calcium is absorbed, maybe 15% of magnesium ions are absorbed, and a little bit of ammonium cation can be absorbed. Chloride will be given full credit, sulfate about 0.6, and phosphate about half of it gets absorbed. So if you're a nutritionist and you like to feed a low DCAD diet and you like to feed a high calcium diet, chances are you're adding limestone or calcium carbonate to that diet. And realize that when you add limestone, calcium carbonate, it is slightly alkalinizing. So to hit that sweet spot of a urine pH of about 6.3, with a diet that's maybe bringing in or raising the calcium to about 1.5%, your DCAD has to be reduced. You have to feed more anions to hit that same sweet spot of about 6.3 because the limestone is alkalinizing, okay? That also means that sometimes if you're in a state over here, we're in an uncompensated metabolic acidosis, by adding limestone, you can bring those animals back towards a compensated metabolic acidosis. So limestone is a double-edged sword. It's going to cost you more anions to achieve the same amount of acidification, and adding limestone can sometimes take a diet that was too heavily loaded in anions and bring it back to a compensated metabolic acidosis. If you're down here, urine pH down below 5.4, that animal is in a state of uncompensated metabolic acidosis. Its only reaction that it can do to save its life is to quit eating. It's going to reduce the amount of anions it's taking in. Urine pH is checking urine pH is everybody's favorite job. You probably should wear gloves because leptospirosis is a real problem. You want to make sure it's a midstream collection of the urine. And there's various ways to do it. pH meters are great. However, when I walk on farms and ask when was the last time that pH meter was calibrated, I usually get a blank stare. So I found these little strips. pH Ion is a nice one that's fairly convenient. This one by Runbow has a little bit different color scheme. Some people like the red, green, turning to blue scheme better than the pH Ion type scheme. But some of these are nice because they're in sealable bottles, as opposed to the old pH strips that you could unroll the roll and throw it back in your truck and realize that 3 days later it was all hydrated from water in the air. We started looking at plasma calcium nadir. So we take blood samples from cows at least 3 times on that first day of calving, and we find the lowest calcium in each cow. And we plotted that against the urine pH of that cow during the week before she calved. And what we see is that if urine pH is above 7.5, you can have some cows that become quite hypocalcemic. Once you start getting below 7.5, you see a nice increase in calcium as urine pH drops. So this would suggest that the lower the urine pH, the better. However, let me go back to that. You can see in our data set here, because I'm a very conservative guy, I don't have a lot of cows down here around 5.5. Pedro Melendez presented this at this year's ADSA meeting. This shows a little bit of a curvilinear response here, where the optimal urine pH is somewhere around 6.5. And once you start getting below that, you start seeing something of a decrease in blood calcium concentration around the time of calving. In other words, it may not be optimal to keep acidifying these cows beyond pH of 6.0. This is also a conclusion of this paper from Acidiglu, published in 2016, where they looked at the health of these animals, particularly left-displaced abomasum. And they found that cows that had left-displaced abomasum had much lower urine pH than the cows that were in the healthy group. Their blood calciums were slightly better maybe, but this impact on other health issues with a very low blood pH and a very low urine pH was something to keep in mind. Okay, moving on to other minerals. Let's talk a little bit about phosphorus. And here's my scheme for how I'd like to feed the close-up cow. I'm going to keep phosphorus at somewhere around 0.25 to 0.31%. That is lower than probably I recommended 5 years ago. And it's because we've learned a few things about phosphorus in the last 10 years. Now, in addition to stimulating intestinal calcium transport, 125 vitamin D also stimulates phosphorus absorption by the epithelial cells of the intestine. We now know that there's such a thing as phosphorus homeostasis, and it revolves around this strange little bone hormone called fibroblast growth factor 23. And this is what I mean. If you should have a rise in blood phosphorus concentration, that will stimulate the osteocytes of the bone. Those bone cells are very sensitive to a rise in blood phosphorus concentration. They start producing this hormone called fibroblast growth factor 23, which circulates to the kidney and shuts off the enzyme that will stimulate production of 125 dihydroxyvitamin D. If I shut off production of this hormone, I shut off intestinal phosphorus absorption, which will result in a drop in blood phosphorus concentration. On the other hand, if I've got too low of a blood phosphorus concentration, I shut off production of fibroblast growth factor by the bone osteocytes. That allows the kidney to make more 125 dihydroxyvitamin D, which stimulates the intestinal cells to absorb phosphorus, and it will raise my blood phosphorus concentration. Unfortunately, if we feed high blood phosphorus or feed diets that are higher in phosphorus to cows and raise their blood phosphorus concentration even just a little bit, we stimulate fibroblast growth factor 23. That's great. It reduces blood phosphorus, but look what else it does. It shuts off calcium absorption. So it has a negative impact on calcium homeostasis. I was lucky enough to be involved with Dave Beatty and his graduate student, and we did a little study. We're looking at diet phosphorus concentrations in close-up cows, and they fed either 0.21, 0.31, or 0.44% phosphorus diets. Cows that were fed the higher phosphorus diet had lower blood calcium concentration around the time of calving. Even the cows fed the 0.21% phosphorus diet had normal levels of magnesium or of phosphorus in their blood, 4 to 6 milligrams per deciliter. There was no effect on milk production. Many people see this number 0.21% and they're going to think, oh, this is one of those causes of the hypophosphatemic downer cow. No, it is not. This study goes even further. This is a study done in Germany, and they fed 0.15% phosphorus versus 0.28% phosphorus. And in this study on day 1, the cows fed the lower phosphorus diet had better calcium concentrations than the ones on the higher phosphorus diet, and that was true even on day 3 as well. Walter Grunberg did this study in Germany. Unfortunately, I don't think they measured fibroblast growth factor 23 in these animals. Would have been a great addition to the study. The point is, you can feed a very low phosphorus diet to a cow prior to calving, not upset her phosphorus homeostasis. She'll have plenty of phosphorus to maintain her blood phosphorus, but It seems to improve calcium homeostasis. This goes back to studies done by Barb Barton and Tom Kachura years ago that showed when you got phosphorus in the diet too high, you actually caused milk fever. Now we're going to take the other tactic. Let's lower blood or dietary phosphorus and blood phosphorus to improve blood calcium homeostasis. Next, we're going to look at magnesium. And I like to keep magnesium at about 0.4%, and I'm going to do that to utilize passive absorption of magnesium across the rumen wall. Ruminants are strange little animals. They can only absorb diet magnesium across the rumen wall. The small intestine of adult ruminants is actually a net secretor of magnesium. Now they have several transport processes, 2 transport processes for pushing magnesium across the rumen wall. One is the main transport process, especially when diet magnesium is low. But unfortunately, this one's rather easily poisoned by diets that are high in potassium or particularly non-protein nitrogen. There's a second passive transport system that exists, but it only works if ionized magnesium concentration in the rumen fluid is relatively high. And to achieve those kinds of rumen fluid ionized magnesium levels, we need to feed magnesium at about 0.4% of the diet, both pre-calving and in that early postpartum period. And that's to take advantage of this passive transporter. To do this, make sure your magnesium source is available to the animal, and it has to be very finely ground. How do you check if your animals have hypomagnesemia as a problem? Pull a blood sample. If their blood magnesium is less than 1.9 milligrams per deciliter within 12 hours of calving, you have a problem with either inadequate dietary magnesium or inadequate availability of the magnesium in your diet. Outcomes will be secondary hypocalcemia. And as an aside, I put this little note in here. This is probably the most common cause of what people call the mid-lactation milk fever cow. That is usually a cow who is down. She responds to a bottle of calcium given intravenously. She is truly hypocalcemic, but the underlying cause is a failure to have enough magnesium in her diet. Hypomagnesemia also depresses feed intake, can mess up rumen fermentation. This is tremendous work done by Clarence Ammerman back in the late 60s, early 70s. If you get really low in magnesium, you'll see grass tetany and lactation tetany, and that's when your blood magnesium falls below about 1.2 milligrams per deciliter. This is not common in confined cows, but actually fairly common in areas where grazing is occurring. If you're from New Zealand, you know all about this one. Let's take a look at magnesium sources. Prior to calving, if we're using mag sulfate or mag chloride as anions, and almost all the commercial supplements that are sold have either mag sulfate or mag chloride in them now, that's going to supply a very readily available, very soluble magnesium source. So that takes magnesium off the table for pre-calving if you're using the anion supplements. The problem for many of these cows becomes the problem after calving. After calving, most nutritionists are adding magnesium oxide as the source of magnesium to the diet. They're doing that because it's going to supply magnesium to the animal, but they're doing it also to alkalinize the pH of the rumen. Most nutritionists use a combination of sodium bicarbonate, potassium carbonate, and magnesium oxide as their rumen buffer additives to the diet. Magnesium oxide can do all these things, but there's problems with magnesium oxide. All magnesium oxides are not created equal. And unfortunately, we have found a wide variation in the quality of magnesium oxides that are on dairy farms. Unfortunately, there's a lot of cheap stuff coming into the country that just don't provide an available magnesium source to the animal. So how are you going to tell if you got a good magnesium oxide versus a bad magnesium oxide? You can do this little test. Weigh out 3 grams of mag oxide, add 40 mils of white vinegar. In the United States, it's all 5% acetic acid across the board. You can go in any grocery store and buy it like this. Cap the container and shake it well. Shake it again at the 15-minute mark, and then let it sit till the 30-minute mark. At 30 minutes, check the pH. Vinegar normally has a pH 2.6 to 2.8. Good mag oxides will bring the pH up over 8. A lot of the ones on the market are somewhere between 3.8 and about 5.5. These are not adequate, in my opinion. Remember, pH is a logarithmic scale. So let's say you had a pH of 4.2. To go from 4.2 to 5.2, that's a 10-fold difference in alkalinizing action. Go from 5.2 to 6.2 times 10, now we're up to a 100-fold difference. 6.2 to 7.2 times 10, a 1,000-fold difference. 7.2 to 8.2 times 10, that's a 10,000-fold difference in how much hydrogen ion can be buffered. The next strategy that can be used is to try to reduce dietary calcium prior to calving to stimulate parathyroid hormone release well before calving. This is an old study now done by Howard Green, where he compared feeding 80 grams of calcium per day to cows versus 8 grams of calcium per day. This is the total diet calcium, 8 versus 80. And cows that were fed the higher calcium diet got rather severely hypocalcemic, some of them got milk fever and then recovered. The cows that were fed the very low calcium diet for at least 2 weeks before calving, you can see that they went through calving with only a very minor drop in blood calcium concentration. Feeding low calcium diets like this, way below the requirement of the cow. Remember, the cow has to absorb 18 grams of calcium per day prior to calving. You feed much less than that, you will stimulate parathyroid hormone long before she calves. Prolonged exposure of those tissues to parathyroid hormone, even under alkaline conditions, will stimulate bone resorption and production of 125 vitamin D prior to calving and prevent milk fever. This is an old notion. It does work, but you have to be very severely restricted on dietary calcium. Restricting it to 40 grams of calcium per day is not enough. You have to be well below 40 grams of calcium per day to make this idea work. Generally, this has been impractical on dairy farms as a way to prevent milk fever. However, recently, a product made from zeolite has become available to use. And this zeolite product actually binds calcium and prevents it from being absorbed. Now, this is a sodium aluminosilicate, and you add it to the diet and it binds the calcium. In a test tube, I can only find one published remark on this, but sodium aluminosilicate in a test tube will bind 1 gram of calcium for every 10 grams of zeolite. Typically, this is fed at about 500 grams of zeolite per day, which means it should be able to bind about 50 grams of calcium. Keep in mind it binds phosphate and it binds magnesium also, so you'll see a transient reduction in levels of magnesium and phosphorus in the blood. This is a study published out of Cornell a year or so ago, where they fed that 500 grams of zeolite to the cows each day. That diet was 0.65% calcium, so a low calcium diet. This is within practical realms. 0.39% phosphorus, 0.42% magnesium. You can see that the cows fed the zeolite product had higher blood calcium concentration through the periparturient period than the cows that were not fed the zeolite. You can see a huge difference in blood phosphorus concentrations. Zeolite seems to bind the phosphorus, preventing it from being absorbed as well. Maybe this is a good thing in terms of lowering blood phosphorus concentration. I don't know that anybody's examined that yet. It also binds magnesium, and this is bringing magnesium down to very low levels. But I can tell you from the reports that there seems to be no major issues caused by this. The animals, when this works, the animals will recover nicely. You still have to control dietary calcium quite carefully. You can't just add this to any old diet. You have to keep diet calcium relatively low so it can bind that calcium that's left and bring the animal to a deficient zone. One of the bad things about zeolite is that it seems to depress dry matter intake. There is a lot of rock that's being added to that diet. And so you'll see a decrease in rumination rate and a decrease in dry matter intake, particularly the last week or so before calving. However, after calving, just as with all other milk fever prevention type schemes, you see a better, or perhaps a trend towards a better dry matter intake after calving. Vitamin D comes next. And let's just say that vitamin D administration right now is too dangerous and the effective dose is too close to the toxic dose. We'll move on to the oral calcium drenches and boluses. Under special circumstances, you don't need 125 vitamin D to absorb dietary calcium. This is called passive transfer of calcium across the gut. It only occurs if you get the ionized calcium concentration in the gut above 6 millimolar. And at that point, calcium starts flowing between cells into the blood. This has been known for a long time. If you give an animal a drench with a very high amount of calcium in the form of calcium chloride, so it's very readily solubilized, it will be absorbed very rapidly into the blood. Now, when I got out of vet school, I was told that I should treat every third lactation and greater cow with a bottle of calcium IV to prevent her from getting milk fever. And so this study looks at the effect of that IV bottle of calcium versus no treatment versus cows who are getting an oral calcium bolus. In this case, it happened to be Bulvacalc. You can see that cows that are not treated with anything, they have some hypocalcemia, but eventually they recover. If you give them an IV, yeah, for that first 8 or 10 hours, they have nice blood calcium concentration. But when you look at them 24 to 36 hours after calving, their blood calcium concentration is actually lower than if you had done nothing at all to those cows. The oral calcium bolus, as is typical for all studies with oral calcium boluses, you get a small rise in blood calcium concentration, not a very big one, but it seems to hold them a little bit better the next day. That rise in blood calcium concentration, I don't believe is why these animals are better off on day 2. I think what it is that the calcium chloride that's in these boluses tends to be acidifying. I'm going to jump to this study by Katrina Roberts in New Zealand, where they showed that these boluses actually will acidify cows after calving. So here they gave a calcium chloride type bolus at the first milking and again 12 hours later. If you looked at the urine pHs of these animals, 12 hours after calving, 41% of the treated cows had urine pH below 7, none of the control cows. The second bolus given 12 hours after calving, 13 out of 13, 100% of the treated cows had urine pH below 7, none of the untreated cows. I think some of the effect of these oral calcium boluses is to continue the acidification process of these animals into the first day of lactation when you've switched them onto a lactating cow diet. I'm going to probably end with this because I see the time is running low. This is a great study. I love this study that Jessica McCart did it at Cornell. What she showed by taking blood samples from cows during the first 4 to 5 days after calving, what she showed is that there's some cows who go through the calving process, have only a very, very small drop in blood calcium concentration and recover quite nicely. These cows we're going to call normal calcemic. And then Jessica showed that there are another group of cows that on that day of calving, their blood calcium can fall quite low. But by day 2, they've recovered and they go on their merry way. The interesting thing about this study was that she showed that the cows who were normal calcemic on the day of calving were not making as much milk as the cows who were hypocalcemic on day 1. Jessica also showed that there's another form that's most dangerous to these cows, the cows that develop hypocalcemia and take a long time to recover. These are cows that are likely to be culled. Then she had a smaller group of animals that develop hypocalcemia only after day 2. And these animals also seem to have a high risk of calving or of being culled. What I found most interesting is that hypocalcemia is normal. It's almost to be expected if you expect to have high milk production. The key is whether they recover quickly after calving. And this is where anionic salts and perhaps the zeolite and other treatments you might apply. This is what you're hoping to do, is bring them back to normal by day 2. And with that, I probably better end it.
New research is changing everything we thought we knew about choline's impact on the cow and her calf, and top scientists have a lot to say about it. They are presenting new research that supports choline as a required nutrient to optimize milk production, choline as a required nutrient to support a healthy transition, choline as a required nutrient to improve calf health and growth, and choline as a required nutrient to increase colostrum quantity. This new research is solidifying choline's role as a required nutrient for essentially every cow, regardless of health status, milk production level, or body condition score. Learn more about the science that is changing the game and the choline source that is making it happen. Reassure precision-release choline from Balchem. Visit balchem.com/scientistsay to learn more.
Dr. Goff, this has been a highly anticipated webinar. In fact, we got our first question yesterday, so I'll ask it first. And this comes from Jaime in Mexico. And it's a couple questions here. What will be your comment for DCAD balance in Jersey cows?
Yeah, years ago, I used to think I had to hit the little Jerseys a little bit harder to prevent milk fever than I do the Holsteins. I'm kind of backed off on that a little bit. I think if you get them down around 6.2, 6.3 for urine pH, that's probably going to be okay. I used to think perhaps the Jerseys had so much more problems with milk fever, I had to hit them a little bit harder. But I think the depression and dry matter intake that you might see when you try to go to a lower urine pH probably cause more problems than the lower urine pH prevented. I backed off on that a little bit.
Okay, and then this is a related question. Are there any different considerations for prepartum DCAD balance in Jerseys compared to Holsteins?
Well, it goes back to the same idea. I don't think we need to make a much lower DCAD diet for a Jersey than for a Holstein. As long as we're achieving urine pHs of around 6.2, 6.3 as an average, we're probably in good shape.
Okay. Next question, when checking urine pH in pre-fresh cows, how many cows should be tested? How many days on ration? And does time after feeding matter?
8, yes, no. Yes, I get asked these questions all the time. I don't know that there's any magic to it. When should urine pH be tested? Research would suggest that 8 hours, 9 hours after they've been fed would be the optimal time to see the DCAD diet. However, I'm going to tell you, you do it when it's convenient. Do it. If you want to know, just get into a routine of doing it when the cows first stand up is usually the easiest time. Let's see, how many cows? 8 is kind of a number that people throw out. I think Gary Etzel started me on this, that you had to have 8 as a population type number. If you have less than 8 cows in the close-up pen, obviously you try to get as many of them as you can. If you have 100 in there, 8 will probably give you a good idea of what their urine pH is. Let's see, what was the other part of that question? Did I get all 3?
Yeah, I believe you've got all 3 of them there. Let's see. The next question comes to us from Kate. Do you think the palatability issues are purely related to the anionic salts or related to the metabolic acidosis? Thinking of work at University of Florida, Sancho, I think.
Yeah, yep. Jose and I have talked about this. Certainly, there are anion salts that we fed to cows, and we saw their dry matter intake drop long before they ever got acidified. So I think we have to look at this 2 ways. Some anion products are so unpalatable that we can't get cows to eat enough to become acidotic. But then you take a look at some of the products, Soychlor, Jose's study I think was done with Biochlor, Animate. There's other products that are more palatable. You can get cows to eat those, and at some point you will find that you have over-acidified that cow, and her response to over-acidification to keep her from dying of uncompensated metabolic acidosis is to reduce her dry matter intake. So it's a double-edged sword. Some anion products are so unpalatable you can't get cows to eat enough of them to become acidified to prevent milk fever successfully. And there are some products that we can successfully get them to eat them, but we've included too much of them in the diet and are creating an uncompensated metabolic acidosis, the response to which the only response the cow has is to decrease dry matter intake. Hope that makes sense.
Very well. Our next question, Patrick is asking, doesn't AMTS and NDES take into account calcium carbonate on the DCAD calculation?
Depends which equation they're using. Some of them have the full length equation in them. Some of them do not. The typical sodium plus potassium minus chloride plus sulfate that most people are going by doesn't take that into account.
Very well. Bernard would like to know, is there an on-farm calcite test for blood calcium levels?
There is. There are these little meters that you can purchase that will measure ionized calcium concentration in blood. It just takes a drop of this, put on a special strip that is read by the machine. The machines are, I don't know, close to $1,000 each. More importantly, the strips that are utilized are pretty expensive. I think at least $12 for each test. So while it's done in research settings quite routinely, I think most veterinarians and most farms are going to find that that fee is too high to utilize. They're too expensive on farm.
All right, thank you for that.
There were old tests where people tried to measure how long it took for the blood to clot. Calcium is required for the clotting process of blood, so people would pull a sample and then try to see how long it took for the blood to clot. you could do it, but you had to have patience, and it had a really wide variation in results. It was not for the faint of heart.
All right, the next question comes from Ohio, and James would like to know, what are your thoughts on high D, 25 vitamin D?
Yeah, I kind of skipped over that slide. I have a slide on that. 25 hydroxyvitamin D. It's an interesting metabolite. Vitamin D is converted in the liver to 25 hydroxyvitamin D. 25 hydroxyvitamin D has now been synthesized so that it's relatively inexpensive. Unfortunately, all the studies that I'm aware of where you try to use 25 hydroxyvitamin D to prevent milk fever have failed. It does not get converted to the 125 dihydroxyvitamin D very well. If you were to give us a really, really big dose of it, you might get it to interact with the intestinal epithelial cells and stimulate intestinal calcium absorption, but you will have lost control, and there's a possibility it might be toxic. So I don't think that is the answer for preventing milk fever. There's some really interesting work I'm aware of down in Florida where they're using it for other reasons related to milk production, perhaps. But as far as preventing milk fever, I wouldn't recommend high D as a strategy.
Very well. The next question comes from Angelie. Do you recommend to use DCAD diet in heifers?
I do not. If I have a chance, I pull the heifers out. But in these smaller herds where both the cows and the heifers are mixed together in the close-up pen, I'm going to feed the anionic diet. And again, this may be why I'm a little more conservative. That urine pH of 6.2 as an average isn't going to cause any problems for those heifers. If you were to shoot for a urine pH of 5.7, 5.8, maybe that would be negative impact on the heifers. Heifers, there's at least a couple of studies that suggest that heifers on anionic salts, particularly if chloride is being used, chloride has a diuretic effect, and less udder edema was observed, but it's a small effect. I wouldn't count on it as the way to prevent udder edema in heifers. For me, if I have a chance, I don't feed anionic salts to the heifer.
Very well, and we're getting a little long here. There are lots of questions, Dr. Goff, but we're gonna end it on this last one, and this comes from Eric. If hypocalcemia is normal in high-producing cows, why take blood samples at 12 to 24 hours postpartum? Wouldn't 24 to 36 hours make more sense?
Because I'm a researcher, that's why I do it. But as a practical thing for a veterinarian or herdsman to do to see what their level is, I'll probably go as long as 48 hours. I'd probably routinely try to pull a sample 36 to 48 hours to catch Jessica McCart's chronic subclinically hypocalcemic cow. That's the one that you are interested in as a herd manager. That 12 to 24 hour blood sample being low doesn't necessarily indicate that you have a problem with hypocalcemia and milk fever control. It probably means you got really good producing cows.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Goff, and thank you, everyone.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests, so please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.